I want you to just picture this for a second. It is pitch black, October 27th, 1942. You're in the South Pacific, and the only light for miles is the horrifying glow of a burning ship. That ship, that's the USS Hornet. And watching it die, watching the last operational American fleet carrier in the Pacific get torn apart, is Commander Edward P. Parker. The words you see here, 4 carriers in 10 months, that's not some official report. That's a man writing in his private log. It is pure, unfiltered despair. It's the sound of a man on the front line of a losing war, doing the grim math and realizing they are staring into the abyss. And this moment, this absolute rock bottom, this is where our story begins.
Because out of that moment of total failure, something almost unbelievable happened. This isn't just a story about war. It's really a story about an answer. An answer that wasn't found in some brilliant new battle plan, but was forged in the fire and steel of American shipyards, thousands of miles from the fight. We're going to dig into how a nation that was, by all accounts, on the very brink of naval collapse didn't just fight back. No, it unleashed the single greatest production story in the history of the world. A story that didn't just change the war, it changed the shape of the world we live in today. This is how that comeback started.
You know, to really grasp the scale of the miracle, you first have to understand the scale of the disaster. You have to stare right into that abyss with them. In the year 1942, for the U.S. Navy, it was just an absolute, unrelenting catastrophe. The aircraft carrier was the new queen of the seas, right? It was the center of the entire Pacific strategy. And America was losing them faster than anyone anywhere had ever thought was possible. Okay, look at this. What's so terrifying here isn't just the losses themselves. It's the rhythm. It's the drumbeat of defeat. May, June, September, October, boom, 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 boom. First, the Lexington, one of the huge pre-war carriers, gone in the Coral Sea. Then, just a month later, at Midway, the Yorktown, the hero of the Coral Sea, patched up and sent back into the fight, is lost. Then, the Wasp, torpedoed while desperately trying to keep the Marines on Guadalcanal alive. And finally, the Hornet, the ship that launched the famous Doolittle raid against Tokyo, gone. 4 fleet carriers, the entire heart of the Pacific Fleet, just ripped out in less than 6 months. And this wasn't just some panic on the front lines. No, this comes from the very, very top. Admiral Ernest King, the famously tough, no-nonsense chief of naval operations. He's standing in front of Congress, and he's laying out the cold, hard numbers. 1. We have 1 carrier left, the USS Enterprise. 1 ship against the entire Japanese fleet. I mean, can you just imagine the silence in that room? The weight of that statement. He isn't just giving them bad news. He's admitting that by any rational calculation, by simple math, the war is already over. The numbers said they had lost. And that right there is the real question, isn't it? When all the experts and all the admirals and the simple cold hard math says it's impossible, what do you do? How do you fight that? Well, it turns out you don't fight it. You have to change the equation itself. And the answer to how they did that, it was found nearly 4,000 miles away from all that fire and smoke in the Pacific. And right here, this is where the whole story pivots. We're going to leave the admirals and the battlefields for a minute and turn our focus to people you've probably never heard of. Because the war wasn't going to be won by fighting smarter out there. It was going to be won by building faster back here. This is the story of the moment that a sleeping giant, the American industrial base, was violently shaken awake. And this is so crucial to understand. The heroes of this great turnaround weren't just the sailors and the pilots. They were people like Margaret Thompson, a welder from Virginia. They were people who'd never even seen a shipyard before 1941. We're talking about housewives, farm boys, teachers, folks who became the soldiers of a brand new kind of army, an army of production. And they were all driven by this cold, unifying anger. Now here, this is one of those perfect little moments where history turns on a simple question. This wasn't some chief engineer in a lab. This was a former seamstress, Helen Matthews. She's looking at how they built ships, the slow, back-breaking process of riveting, joining massive steel plates with thousands and thousands of individual red-hot metal pins. And she sees it through her eyes, and she just asks, why don't you sew it? It's a question from a total outsider, and that idea, welding ships together with one continuous seam instead of 1,000 little dots, that wasn't just a small change. It was the key, the conceptual breakthrough that was about to unlock impossible speed. So how did they actually pull it off? I mean, how do you really go from a simple question from a seamstress to launching a fleet that's going to dominate the world? Well, now we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of it, or maybe I should say the welds and the modules of this incredible industrial miracle. I mean, the difference between these two ways of building was just night and day. Riveting was a true craft. It took years to become a master riveter. But welding? You could teach a brand new worker, someone who's never held a tool like that before, to be pretty good at it in a matter of days. It was so much faster, and it actually created hulls that were stronger and lighter. And the result? Just look at that number. It cut the time it took to assemble a ship's hull by 75%. Think about that. That's not just an improvement. That's a total reinvention of how to build ships. And it was the engine that powered everything that came next. Right, so this newfound ability to weld everything just opened up a whole new way of thinking. A lot of it borrowed from guys like Henry Kaiser and the car industry. Instead of building a ship from the bottom up in one place, which took forever, they started prefabricating huge sections on the shore. I'm talking entire deck houses, engine rooms, massive pieces. Then, giant cranes would just lift these modules, these giant building blocks, into place. They basically assembled the carrier like a massive Lego set. And they standardized everything. A valve made in Ohio had to fit perfectly into a carrier being built in Massachusetts. It was the automobile assembly line, but scaled up to build the largest moving objects humans had ever created. And if you want to know what that revolution felt like for the people actually doing it, listen to this. This isn't some official report. These are lines from the personal diary of a welder named Philip Kellogg. You can just feel the speed picking up in his words. In January 43, a new fleet carrier every 2 months. That's already insane. By June, just 6 months later, it's down to every month and a half. And then, by the end of that same year, a brand new, top-of-the-line Essex-class carrier is hitting the water every 30 days. He was right. To the enemy who took years to build one carrier, this must have felt like black magic.
So, who were these magicians? Well, this chart here tells a story of a social revolution. Look at that. Only 10% of the workers were experienced pre-war shipbuilders. The other 90%? Totally new. And look who they were. 40% were women, the famous Rosie the Riveters and Wendy the Welders, who walked out of their homes and into the shipyards. 15% were African Americans who, for the first time, were getting access to high-paying, skilled industrial jobs that had always been denied to them. It was incredible. A new American Navy was literally being built by a new American workforce.
Okay, so what was the result of all of this? What happens when this unbelievable wave of steel and power finally hits the Pacific Ocean? Well, the effect was so overwhelming that Japanese officers would later say it was like trying to fight the stars in the sky. No matter how many you shot down, there were always countless more right behind them. So here it is, the direct mathematical answer to those 4 carriers lost back in 1942. 14. Not just 14 ships, 14 bigger, faster, more powerful Essex-class fleet carriers that were built, launched, and sent into combat in just over 2 years. I mean, that's more fleet carriers than Japan built during the entire war. For every single carrier America lost in its darkest hour, it answered with more than 3 new ones. And this chart, this just shows the scale of it all in the most brutal way possible. You see that tiny little sliver on the left? 1. That was the U.S. carrier fleet at the end of 42. And that skyscraper next to it? That's the fleet by mid-1945. Over 100 carriers of all types. It's a visual of a crisis being solved, not with tactics, but with just overwhelming, unstoppable industrial force. The war of numbers that America was losing so badly was now an avalanche that they had unleashed on their enemy. Now, let's hear what it was like to be on the receiving end of that avalanche. This quote from a Japanese commander's diary is just wow. He gets right to the core of their unsolvable problem. It wasn't about sinking ships anymore. How could it be? The Americans were building them faster than Japan could even train pilots to attack them. You can feel the dawning horror in his words, this realization that the entire reality of the war had been turned upside down. They were not fighting the same Navy, not even close. And this just hammers that point home. It's not like the Japanese were stupid. Their intelligence was good. They made a rational estimate. Maybe the Americans could build 6, maybe 7 new carriers by 1945, and that alone would have been a huge problem for them. But the actual number, it was so far beyond their worst-case scenario that their entire strategy just disintegrated. How do you plan to fight an enemy whose ability to replace its losses is literally, in their own words, beyond comprehension? And this is the final result on the battlefield. Admiral Ozawa, he was the man who commanded the Japanese carriers at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. A battle American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. He was the one who had to face that American swarm, and the outcome was so lopsided, so completely devastating, that he couldn't even bring himself to call it a battle. It was an execution. That is a chilling, final verdict on what happens when tactical skill runs into an unstoppable industrial machine. You know, the story doesn't end when the war does. The impact of this production miracle reached so far beyond the battlefield. It actually helped forge the society and the economy of modern America in ways we still feel every single day. And who better to sum it all up than Admiral Nimitz himself, the overall commander in the Pacific? He says it all right here. The decisive moment of the war wasn't some clever maneuver at sea. It was the moment those new carriers started sliding into the water back in Brooklyn and Newport News. It's a simple truth. When you can replace your losses and your enemy can't, victory is no longer a question of if, but when. The war was truly won in the factories. And that victory left behind a profound legacy. Those billions in wages paid to workers helped create the powerful American middle class after the war. The experience proved to a whole lot of skeptical people that women and minorities could master any industrial job, which was a huge crack in old social barriers. Those production techniques, like modular construction, became the standard for the whole world. But I think the most important thing it proved was this. A democracy's greatest weapon isn't its bombs. It's the unified, productive power of its people when they decide to work together. And that brings us back to where we started, in a way. Back to Margaret Thompson, the welder. Years later, at a reunion, she kind of rejected that title of the greatest generation. And her words, man, they just cut right to the heart of this whole thing. This miracle wasn't born out of some abstract idea of greatness. It was born from anger. It was a collective, national response to an attack. Every single weld they laid down, every piece of steel they joined, it was an act of defiance. It was a whole nation taking its grief and its rage and turning it into an unstoppable tide of steel. So all of this, it leaves us with a pretty powerful question, doesn't it? That generation, they faced a crisis that the math said was a certain defeat. And their answer was to mobilize, to innovate, and to outbuild the problem on a scale the world had never seen before and hasn't seen since. It really makes you stop and think. When we face the great challenges of our time, what's our answer going to be? What's our shipyard miracle? That is something worth thinking about.